Josh, yes.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Susan.
Hi, Susan. Hi, Peter. Amy.
Josh is in the,
I
there he
see
is.
Josh.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Evening.
All right, I guess we're ready to start. It looks like everyone is here. This is our first Zoom meeting in quite some time. Let's begin with the date. Today is Tuesday, January 11th, 2022. This is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The first item on the agenda is roll call. Joe Murphy,
Here.
Susan Axelrod,
Here.
Paul Jordan,
Here.
Josh Daly,
Here.
Peter DiStefano,
Here.
Robin Pothier,
Here.
and Maria Mack is here. Also attending this evening are Jamie Rabbit, Director of Planning, Jay Parker from the Planning Department, Brian Wagner from the Planning Department, Amy Goins, Special Legal Counsel. I don't believe we have anyone from DPS this evening. Our first agenda item is zoning text and map amendment, South County Hospital. Jamie, would you like to give us an update in what has transpired in the last month?
Just, Madam Chair, before we do that, we do have three members in the audience. Andrew Prescott, Jack Revens, and Scott is also in the,
Yes.
I think we got Mr. Prescott.
I see Mr. Prescott, so he's been promoted.
Jay, can you bring in Scott Lindgren?
Should be
And
coming now.
There's an MJ Henderson in the audience. Is that part of your team? And Jack, you're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, I think. I
Yes,
don't
you
know
are.
I'm not aware of who MJ Anderson is.
Okay, we just wanted to make sure we had all your team members in.
Thank you.
I'm here, Andrew Prescott for South County Health.
Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, as you remember, originally at your previous work session, we had discussions regarding the text amendment. We stated at your request, as well as the hospitals, that staff would sit down and meet with the hospital to go over some of staff's concerns and review potential language and issues. We did have that meeting on December 17th, Friday, the week before Christmas. Mr. Prescott, Mr. Lindgren, and Mr. Revens, as well as Jay Parker, Brian Wagner, and Amy Goins were at attendance at that meeting. From my perspective, that meeting was a great discussion. Took a lot of positive information away from that discussion. In the interim, we worked with our legal counsel to prepare some suggested revisions to our existing language and how our existing language could be modified in our manner to both protect or leave the planning board in a position similar to the one that they are in a permitting process, as well as the town council with regards to entertaining any revisions to the zoning text and or conditions associated with the zoning map. We did submit suggested revised language in our staff report to the planning board members, Thursday or last Friday. It was sent out.
Yeah, it was Thursday or Friday.
Either late Thursday or early Friday. That information was also forwarded to the applicant and their legal counsel. So that kind of brings us to where we were and where we are. It would be my hopes tonight that the planning board, as well as the applicant, can come to some consensus on staff's recommendation and perhaps forward the matter for discussion and possible action at your January 25th regularly scheduled meeting. Staff is available to answer any questions based on our staff review and recommendations. And again, I'm sure the applicant and their counsel has some information and statements they would like to make. Amy, if you feel like, as legal counsel, please fill in the gaps.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add at this time, thanks, but I can answer whatever questions the board has.
Thanks, Amy. Before we get into a review of the suggested amendments, I would just like to give the applicant an opportunity to make any relatively brief comments. We have Mr. Revens, Mr. Prescott, and Mr. Lindgren here this evening. Who would like to begin?
Jack, I just want to make sure you know your camera's off, and that's fine.
I'll
but
see
just
if I
wanna
can
make sure you
fix,
know.
let me see if I can fix that. Thank you. How's that? Is that better?
Good, thanks.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I didn't get an A+ in technology, but that's because they didn't offer it when I went to school. So I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Jamie and Amy and the planning staff for meeting with my client and I and Scott on the 17th of December. I would agree with Jamie. I think it was a productive meeting. We had a good discussion. At the end of that meeting, we collectively thought it would be best for proposed changes that could be made to the ordinance based on our discussion on the 17th, that those be drafted by the planning department and the town's attorney, which they accomplished. We were hoping we would get that, and we thought we were going to get that directly, so we'd have an opportunity to discuss that further with them before it went to the planning board. But I know with the holiday season, it's very challenging with all the other things that the town's team has to do to get that done. So as you were informed, we got the proposed changes late, basically at the end of the day on Thursday at the same time that you did. And we're happy to have a general discussion about those tonight, but we have not, because of the holiday, because of the snow on Friday, because of the COVID, and because of all the responsibilities that all of us have in addition to this matter. We haven't had an opportunity to sit down virtually or in person to review these line by line and develop specific discussion points because of the short time between the end of business on Thursday and this evening's meeting. But we are happy to have a general discussion about it. We're hopeful to get together later this week with our team and review these line by line and develop specific comments, and probably have another meeting with Jamie and Amy and whoever else they want to have at the meeting, so that we can try to refine some of the suggestions. But there are certainly things that have been proposed that we can work with, and hopefully have something that the staff and the hospital can be in agreement on. But we're not ready to do that now, because as I said, we haven't had the chance to sit down and go through it all. There's a lot of substance to this, and there's a lot of important impacts that this ordinance has on the hospital's operations, as you are well aware, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Revens. I think that we had a deadline of mid-January, or has that been changed? I know there was an extension involved, but just want to know where we're at, and if you require more time, what that would look like in terms of time frame.
I don't recall what the deadline is. I'm sure that either Jamie or Amy has that information.
Well, Madam Chair, just from a logistics and timeframe
Mhm.
process. Who, if it's the applicant's wishes that they potentially continue the discussion on this to give them adequate time to meet with staff and further discussions, your next regularly scheduled work session is February 11th. And then your next, February 8th, with a regular session scheduled on the 22nd. So regardless of kind of where we are in the queue with extensions right now, if the applicant's requesting that at the end of the discussion tonight, that this be tabled to your next regularly scheduled work session, that would be February 8th. And then your next, again, your regularly scheduled session is the 22nd. We would at least need extension, and I would put the date at the end of that week, barring a February snowstorm on the 22nd. It does become a little bit easier if we're going to be Zooming that night. So if there is a snowstorm, we potentially still have access to Zoom, and we would potentially be able to hold the meeting regardless of the weather.
So Jamie, are you recommending that it go to you said the end of the week? So by that, do you mean the 25th or,
The 25th would be that Friday.
okay,
I only do that because we are in the winter months and
Yep.
weather
Yep.
may a factor.
yep. Certainly we all understand that the intent was to have a discussion of recommendations at a work session and then vote to vote at the following regular meeting. That said, why don't we go through the staff suggested amendments? And primarily, they actually begin on page 2 with item C, institutional master plan requirement. Board, want to be sure that board members are, thank you, Jay.
So, Madam Chair, if it's okay
Yes.
with you, the planning board members, instead of reading to you the changes, if we can go on page 2 and look at item C and ask if there are any particular questions associated with staff's suggested language here. Again, I don't want to get too far into an explanation or a stance without giving the applicant an opportunity, as they've suggested, to meet with us, if that's the intent of the planning board, to take that route. Because we could spend
Yeah,
time discussing things that could potentially change, but it would be much better if we understood if the planning board had any questions or was concerned about staff's proposed changes. I know the commission would probably like an explanation of the permitting path being the development plan review path versus major development plan, and Jay will be prepared to discuss at least that difference.
I think that would be an important discussion to have. Thank you, Jamie. And since we are all here and we have all read through the document, I do think it's worthwhile to go through it and ask questions if there are any. So why don't we, before we begin with item C, Jay, could you explain the difference and the rationale for the type of framework that has been suggested, that is the master plan versus a major land development project?
Sure. So the primary objective, I think, was Major land development projects come in and they have to go through conceptual master plan and then preliminary plan or vote to be combined by the board. A number of previous amendments that the hospital has been before the planning board for have been conducted in that manner. But looking back at it, we felt that perhaps the two-step approach that normally applies to a development of a site in a instant capacity isn't necessarily applicable here, and that the development plan review would serve the same role in reviewing the document for approval as the major land development process would represent. And I believe this is something that the applicant had also proposed or was agreed with. It would present an opportunity for one review of the document for approval, holding the same type of analysis and review that the board would undertake as if it were a major land development project.
Madam Chair, similar to the major land development, both processes have a mandatory public hearing associated with them. So again, to Jay's point, we've allowed it to be consolidated into one permitting process, one public hearing versus the two steps. It accomplishes the same thing in the end, a required decision by the planning board on approval of the master plan. We didn't see the need for a two-step process.
Thank you, Jay and Jamie. So essentially, this makes it a more efficient process for the applicant without eliminating the public portion of the review process, correct?
Yeah, Madam Chair, to your point, absolutely. I think it makes it more efficient for the applicant. It makes it more efficient for the planning board as well as the public.
Does anyone have any questions about this particular methodology? All right, well, let's proceed then to page 2, item C. It begins with institutional master plan requirement. Does anyone have any questions on this particular section?
I do.
Go ahead, Robin.
So line 4 involving the public meeting, there's no description of where that meeting has to be. I mean, could it be in Providence? Can it, and it refers to one meeting. What if that one meeting needed to be continued because many people didn't get an opportunity to share their comments?
Madam Chair, this was something that the hospital discussed early on, that they would be, they thought it would be a good idea if they met with the community. It's not a regulatory requirement contained in Rhode Island state law with regards to the development plan review process, but it's something the hospital offered. We did add language associated with this process that there has to be notice to the abutters, and that just be mailed. It's not certified return receipt. It has to be held in a public kind of venue. Some of this, Robin, to your point, there has to be some good faith effort both on the planning board, the community, and the hospital that they are going to hold this at a reasonable hour in a reasonable place and provide the notice within the confines of the regulations. I don't think it's anticipated that the hospital is going to have a meeting that's scheduled on Block Island and it's on a Monday morning at 7 a.m. I haven't been involved in any discussions like that with the hospital's representatives, either internally or externally, as it relates to this application. So again, it's something that's not mandated by Rhode Island law. It's something the hospital didn't appear to have issues with early on in their regulatory suggestions. We just tried to build some framework that there would be public notice to the abutters, to the hospital. It would be held in an accessible venue. I mean, we could add language
I didn't see the accessible venue section.
Just to add to that, Jamie, this requirement is also contained within the Providence zoning ordinance, so this applies to educational institutions and colleges in Providence that are required to undergo their IMP development plan review process. And really, right, the goal is to try to get the community's input into the master plan so that hopefully by the time the applicant comes before the planning board, you don't get people saying, well, this is the first I'm hearing of it. So it's in the hospital's best interest to comply with the spirit of this requirement, and I think that they will. I don't think that we need to, spell out additional terms in the ordinance, because I think it's in their own interest to make it a welcoming and accessible meeting.
That's exactly why we proposed adding it to the ordinance. Thank you.
Robin, does that answer your question? And as you will see, when we get to page 3, there is a greater level of detail in terms of the public meeting, both at the pre-submittal stage called a public workshop, and then the public hearing after that.
Yeah, that's where I was looking, page 3, item number 4. I personally would prefer some verbiage in there that says that it will be held locally and can be continued. And I mean, how do you know everyone's going to get an opportunity to share their comment? That it's not there in the writing. I think it could be more described.
Understood.
Again, Madam Chair, we can take that under advisement, but again, the intent was that the hospital is going to make a good faith effort under this proposed regulatory change to reach out to their abutters, have a workshop, not have an open-ended workshop, not continue it for 6 different events. But again, provide a venue for the hospital to invite the public in a non-regulatory manner prior to the formal process associated with the planning board. Again, we can provide language, and I'm sure, potentially, sure that the applicant wouldn't be overly concerned if we said it had to be held within South Kingstown. But again, if there was a venue or a restaurant, across the border, just in Narragansett, and the hospital wanted to invite everybody there and pay for dinner or a workshop, I wouldn't want a regulatory aspect to say you can't go over that boundary line. We're fortunate there are some hospitality venues, being the hotels in town, that have large meeting space. There are some of our beach clubs that have meeting space, and the hospital has meeting space. To Amy's point, we can set the parameters, but I really truly believe this is the hospital's meeting. The hospital just needs to pick a reasonable place at a reasonable time.
And Jamie, just to be clear, we are talking about the pre-submittal meeting,
Yes.
correct?
I mean, I would hope that this is just something they do annually, not required by the regulations. I think if they did it annually, when the 5-year time frame for updating their plan came up, that the public's informed, and there may be less concern about any updates associated with the 5-year time frame, because they've been meeting on a regular basis, at least annually.
That certainly makes a lot of sense to me. Does
Madam Chair,
anyone else have any questions on page 2 before we move on to page 3? And if folks speak, could you just please identify yourself so that for the benefit of the public, it's clear who is speaking?
Madam Chair,
Madam Chair, I
Jack
don't know if Attorney Revens had something to say.
Yes, please continue.
Madam Chair, Jack Revens, I just wanted to say that I agree completely with what Jamie just said. That's why we proposed this language in our version to create this meeting for exactly that reason. And it's been my suggestion to my client from the beginning of this process that as we move forward, that we do that annually in an informal way with the community so that there'll be good communication between the hospital and the community. And I know the hospital is committed to doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions on this particular page from planning board members?
Maria, this is Susan. I have a question.
Certainly.
Okay, this is Susan Axelrod. I have a question about the very, very bottom of page 2. The second to last line reads, identifies the specific public actions to be taken. Can I understand what public actions, how the word public is used here and how that differentiates from if the sentence didn't have the word public in it? C1 on the bottom of page, yeah,
Yes.
right there. The second up line.
Jamie, could you clarify that?
That is,
I can-
that
Go
is
ahead, Jamie.
language that exists within our regulations today.
So let me give an example. I'm sure Jack and Andrew can as well. A public action would be, we want to construct a building. A private internal action would be, we want to double the number of heart surgeries we do at this hospital. In other words, we don't care about, not that we don't care, but the town doesn't really have regulatory authority over their internal healthcare goals in the same way that if this were a college, we wouldn't really care whether they want to double the number of liberal arts majors or science majors. We just want to know what are their actions that are, that people are going to see, right? Construction of buildings, things that the planning board normally has purview over. That's what we care about.
So it's external physical type actions.
And
Got it. Thank you very much.
Anyone else on page 2? Let's move on then to page 3. Are there any questions from board members with regard to the language contained 2A, B, 3, 4, 5, and then D, 1 and 2 on this page? Jamie, I just had a question with regard to the public meetings. On item number 4, the pre-submittal public workshop. Does that need to be better defined relative to Robin's question? And although it does suggest later on in the paragraph that notice shall be mailed. So I think that's a very useful item in that particular meeting. And then the public hearing required, which would be prior to any approval by the planning board, shall require a public hearing, which requires the same public notice. So it's 2 different types of meeting, but both of them would require notice. Is that correct, Jamie?
yes, one is basically certified mailing receipt. The other is they just need to show us proof of mailing. People don't have to sign for the receipt of that. Again, I don't want to say that 4 is intended to be that informal process. It could be an open house setting. It could be a tent within the campus. Again, the key there is giving the public an opportunity in a slightly less formal venue to have a discussion with the hospital about concerns. No.
Thus the term workshop as opposed to public hearing. from one paragraph to the other,
Yes.
yes?
Could I ask a question about this? This is Susan again.
Sure.
So I live in a different part of town, but I'm keenly interested in this. Would I be invited to this, or how would I find out about this? Or am I included in the general public who would be included in this?
Typically, those meetings, Susan, are advertised on the institution's website, and notice would be sent to, the institution would maintain an email list of community members who want to receive notices of these meetings, or, typically, and Andrew can probably provide insight, they may have something existing like this. But if not, they could certainly develop an email list. So I think the answer is that they're probably not going to be checking, that they're probably not going to be screening at the door and only admitting folks in who live right next door, but they probably will be keeping a log of who attends in case the town wants to see that. So I think the answer is, unless we get more specific, it can be open-ended. I would anticipate it would be open to anyone, not just their immediate next door neighbors.
Yes, but my question would be, if I were living in another part of town, would I expect to read about this somewhere? Like, how would I even know it's happening if I weren't
There would
checking
be-
here?
No,
There
it's
would
no-
be no notice requirement unless we're adding that. So they already have to foot the bill for the notice for the actual public process, the public hearing, right? All public hearings, the applicant pays the notice for. So unless you're going to require them to put an ad in the paper for the pre-submittal public workshop, the answer would be, my guess is that they would advertise it on their social media and on their website. They may or may not choose to put an ad in the local paper.
Amy, just to follow up on Susan's question, would the town by default be made aware of this workshop?
Before it happens, yeah, I mean, ideally, again, we're thinking about how it would work in an ideal world. In an
Mhm.
ideal world, the hospital would say, maybe a month before the workshop is going to happen, hey, we've planned the workshop for December 1st. Would you like to, put an ad on your website or notify your list? But as far as the language in the ordinance right now, the language does not require the hospital to notify the planning department or the town before it happens. The language requires the hospital to hold the hearing before submittal, and that's one of the boxes they have to check off the submittal checklist.
Madam Chair, I think that the purpose of this, which again is not mandatory under Rhode Island law, is to allow the hospital to have a targeted workshop with its immediate neighborhood. This isn't, and
Mhm.
Prescott and I had an opportunity to talk just briefly about this during our workshop on the 17th. It's targeted. It's not an open house to the entire community or surrounding neighborhood communities, being Narragansett, North Kingstown, South Kingstown, and Charleston as a host hospital. It's intended to have a workshop to get feedback from the immediate neighborhood who are impacted on a daily basis by the operations of the hospital. The formal process, which we can control much more concisely with regards to the public hearing notice required by Rhode Island law, which requires specific notice under Rhode Island law, is much more controlled and intended for broader reach. The difficulty I have of making the workshop so restricted with regards to notice, it becomes an administrative checkbox. If the regulation required it to be posted on their webpage 3 times, who tracks whether it was posted on their webpage 3 times? If they had to take out a newspaper article, that's another thing for us to track. Again, I think the intent of this section, from my understanding, which was originally offered by the hospital, is to be focused, targeted on the immediate neighborhood so they can get feedback from those individuals who deal with the hospital day in, day night, day in, day in, day out.
Thanks,
Madam
Jamie.
Chair,
Paul, you have your hand up?
Yeah, Paul Jordan, the applicant's proposed amendments is in our packet. Actually says a minimum of one neighborhood presentation. Neighborhood organizations, elected officials, and planning department staff shall receive prior written notice. So we certainly have an opportunity if we wanted to. It's not a town meeting. I don't know if we want to post it on the town website, but I think the fact that we're including neighborhood organizations and not just neighbors, as well as elected officials and planning department, it seems to me the word will get out. So.
Thanks, Paul. Anyone else?
Maria, I have a question.
Sure, Joe, go ahead.
It has to do with the last line on 2B, which says the building permits for any improvements scheduled or otherwise shall not be issued by the town for any healthcare institution with an expired master plan. And I just want to understand the implications of that. I mean, if for some reason their master plan gets outdated, maybe not even cause of their own, maybe they're in good faith, they're trying to get it approved, but it's not. Does this mean that they could get no building permits at all for any work within the hospital, even those things that would not require a development plan review? I'd hate to see us get into that situation where they can't get a permit to do some work internal to the building that would maybe not even be reviewed by development plan review. So what's I guess the implications and of that sentence? And I understand the intent. We want to make sure they, update the master plan, but that's my question.
Jamie, do you have an answer for that?
I think, well, we can look at that language. Joe, point well taken, understanding if they needed an electrical permit to swap out lighting in the OR, that is something we can intend to hold up, but we can clarify that. The intent there is any building permit associated with substantial renovations and or expansions contemplated at the hospital.
Yeah, something that maybe otherwise would, something that maybe otherwise would require a development plan review, but for normal, like you said, changing out lighting in an operating room, we want to be in a situation where we don't know how to handle that because this sentence that's in there, that's all.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jamie. Anything else on this page? Let's move on to page 4, which has the remaining items of D, master plan contents. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 10, 11 on this page. Questions, comments? I had a couple of suggestions, and they relate to item 4, parking and circulation analysis. Only that, so that it's perfectly clear when we discuss these kinds of things relating to traffic circulation. So this would be the last sentence on 4. Shall address the adequacy of on-site traffic circulation, parking and loading, sidewalk, pedestrian circulation, delivery, and so on. I feel that given the fact that we are thinking in terms of complete streets these days and attempting to make significant improvements as they relate to pedestrian access and safety, I would suggest adding after the word pedestrian, access, safety, then followed by circulation, just so that it's perfectly clear.
Madam Chair, I don't have any issues with that as your planning staff.
Thank you. Anything else on this page? Jamie, I did have a question, a clarification on number 8. It was a little confusing when the talk about the administrative officer reviewing plans. Initially, it sounded as though minor issues at the conceptual stage. So I'm assuming that's prior to the master plan review, that the board would allow things such as architectural drawings be reviewed by the administrative officer, but it's unclear because later on then it says prior to the issuance of a building permit, which to me sounds like we're talking about something beyond the initial stages. So can you just either explain or give us an idea of how to make that more clear? I don't know if anyone else was a little confused by that paragraph.
Madam Chair, I'll explain the intent and we can look at the wording again.
Sure.
Again, the subject matter we're discussing here is the requirement that the hospital continue along the path that's contained within our existing regulations to file a master plan every 5 years. So if we look at in 2022, the hospital gets a master plan approved. It's for a 5-year time frame. Within that master plan, they intend to do 2 additions. One, we receive full conceptual drawings for that addition. The second one, they include language in the master plan that the structure is of similar size, will have the following functions, and will look very similar or just like the full design we've shown you for the first edition. The intent there is not to make them come back to the planning board for an addition that's referenced in their master plan, that you have conceptual drawings for the elevations and the appearance of that building that's adjacent to it or right next to it. And they, one building's 10,000 square feet, the next building contemplated is 5,000 square feet. Do you feel as a planning board, you need them to come back to you, see what it looks like if it references the fact that it's going to look just like the 10,000 square foot building, only half as big? The intent there is to let them submit that to the administrative officer, who will verify that the smaller building or that second contemplated structure, in fact, is or mirrors what they said it would, that you've already approved. If it's outside the scope and scale, the language gives the administrative officer the ability to say, no, I'm not comfortable signing off on that. It's slightly outside of or slightly different than what you've conceptualized and what was approved by the planning board. So you have to go back to them. It's trying to expedite the process when they know we have a certain outcome.
So this would be a situation whereby the planning board would already have been made aware of an additional building or what have you.
Yeah, it's not intended to,
I see.
not contemplated in their master plan unless there's a reference to it. So it could be,
Well,
the master plan references the need for 3 additional outbuildings, but they only do a rendering of one of the outbuildings. Do you want to see rendering for the next 2 as a master plan revision, or are you able to give that authority to the administrative officer to evaluate the 2 additional outbuildings so long as they match the one they conceptualized in their master plan?
Makes sense. I think we just need perhaps a clarification in the language so that it's understood that it's during the master plan process.
We'll look at that language.
Very good, because we certainly want to create incentives for the hospital to have the flexibility they need, and strongly encourage them to keep their master plan up to date. Any other questions from board members on this particular page? Let's move on then to the next page, number 5. This continues along with items 12 and 13, and then goes into section E, which is exemption from section 603.2 B7 parking requirements, and F, modification to an approved institutional master plan. Comments, questions?
Madam Chair, if you like, we could do a brief explanation of the exemption from 603 to B7 and what the intent of that is.
Thank you, that would be useful.
So under the existing regulations and under the proposed revisions, our parking standards are based on employee count and square footages. They don't give a institution or a campus operator the ability to explain the functionality of their facility. So for example, if they, in a broad place, if you had a requirement of 1 space per 1,000 square feet, and you had a 100,000 square foot facility, you would need 100 spaces. If you then had 100 employees within that, you would need another 100 spaces. So you would need 200 spaces. Suppose that 100,000 square feet, in a really broad example, had 2 pieces of equipment in it that could only see 1 person at a time, but required 100 staff people. You would only need 104 or 106 parking spaces, accommodate staff and accommodate the throughput of patients to that space. Yet our zoning regulations will require them to build 200 parking spaces. This exemption process says if you cannot meet or you would like to seek relief from hard code requirements associated with employee counts and square footage calculations, that you can submit a master parking plan associated with how your campus functions to allow that institution to be more in line with their needs and not build unnecessary parking, which adds to impervious coverage, and takes up additional land.
Thank you, Jamie. Questions on this section from folks? Jamie, I did wonder, I think that this language is very positive and represents quite a bit of flexibility. Just wondering, last section F with the modification to the master plan, whereby there's the first section that relates to no increase in peak traffic hour by more than 5%. How would that be evaluated? And then if there were a change to that, how would that be handled? Just wonder if you or even Mr. Revens, if he is ready to comment on this section, has any thoughts as to how that would be handled.
Again, Madam Chair, as an example, if the hospital was contemplating adding another surgical unit, again, it's a 5-year time frame, so they may make a broad statement that they are intending to add an additional, or just broadly, intended to add additional OR space. There's the potential ability for them to renovate a footprint without doing a building expansion, which would be an exemption, to add OR space, which would be an exemption, so long as the addition of that OR space didn't increase AM or PM peak by more than 5%. So giving you an example, if AM peak was 100 cars in and out, they could add an additional 5 cars within that hour with the associated operating room. But if all of a sudden they're pushing, they're doing 5-minute surgical procedures and can get 20 people in and out in an hour, that would put them at 120 trips, which would put them over the 5%. So it's trying to scale the exemption process to some additional trigger mechanisms, because just because there's a change in a parking count doesn't mean there isn't a change in impact at the street. You can add 5 spaces, but if someone arrives at 8 in the morning and leaves at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, that maybe has less implications than another 20 cars an hour going to the same space or utilization of the space used in a different manner. So again, it's trying to give some parameters and some clarity to what is an acceptable exemption and what would trigger a revision to the master plan and a revisit by the planning board.
And Jamie, I think one of the things that comes to mind with regard to traffic, we know from our experience with, for example, the university, that what relates to their peak hours varies from the ITE handbook that the traffic engineers use. And I would imagine that the hospital as an institution has their own version of what tends to be peak hours for them. Would those particular idiosyncrasies be taken into account with this language?
Yeah, absolutely. The AM, PM peaks, typically there's some guidance within the ITE manual of what an AM and PM peak is. And there's 2 associated with that. There's an AM, PM peak for the street, and then there's an AM, PM peak for the facility. In some aspects, you may have a peak on the street, which doesn't conflict with the peak at the facility. So there's no net gain or loss, even if you're adding to that through traffic on the street. So again, it's an analysis of both the AM, PM peak on the street and the AM, PM peak for the facility. At the hospital, and you have representatives from VHB and Scott's and analyze this a little bit. Typically hospitals, AM, PM peak is associated with shift changes. It's not necessarily associated with visits. It's those big shift changes from third shift leaving, first shift coming in, and then first shift leaving, second shift coming in. And in some aspects, depending on the hours, that does not conflict with any AM, PM peak along a traditional commuting route of 7 to 8:30, 8-ish in the morning. And then that 4 to 5 PM peak. They're usually slightly off of that. And that's why we're recommending going towards an analysis versus just hard counts. If you add 20 parking spaces, you have to come back to the planning board. You could add 20 spaces and they have absolutely no impact on the street or impact on the neighborhood or even the facilities.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. Any other comments or questions from board members on this page? Susan, I think you have your hand raised.
Hi, I would like to actually ask for some clarification for something Jamie just said. So they add an operating room, and right now there's 100 cars per hour, and it adds less than 5 cars per hour, so it doesn't trigger anything. But then next month they add another operating room, and 3 months after that they add another operating room. And so at some point, can that snowball like that? Or at some point, does that trigger something that if you do it incrementally, it won't individually? Yeah.
Jamie, I'm
To me,
sorry.
it would be within the 5-year confines of the master plan. So and again, I used 100 as that example, Susan, but you're probably more like 200 to 300 vehicles. So again, it would allow, the 5% increase would allow maybe 20 to 30 cars to be pushed through an intersection. So again, I think over a time period, it should suffice, but absolutely, I agree with you that you can't do 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, and all of a sudden over 4 years at 100 cars, but you did it every 6 months. That's not the intent of the regulation. And I'm sure that, the hospital may come back and say that that number should be 10%.
Thank you, Jamie. Mr. Lindgren has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Scott Lindgren from VHB. I just wanted to clarify, just to answer that question, is that during our traffic study, we take into consideration, what is put into the projected master plan for growth. And on top of that, we also have a growth factor that's placed into our transportation traffic study as well. So it's not something that would be increasing 5% compoundly, during those peak periods. Mr. Rabbit was correct in terms of the peak periods being different from the roadways versus the facility. But again, that is something that we discussed with the hospital and analyzed during our studies. So all that is taken into consideration. And I do, Jamie, Mr. Rabbit, we could talk a little bit more about the 5% on the peak hour traffic. I do have a concern with that on peak hour traffic. Not so much amount of parking, but the peak hour traffic generation normally fluctuates of 5% on a daily basis, and is within the tolerances on the study. So I think that we'll be looking at increasing that to probably something about 10% for the peak hour traffic if this is accepted by the hospital as moving forward. But the parking and peak hour traffic don't correspond on the percentage. So, it's something that we should discuss and make some modification on.
Thank you, Mr. Lindgren. Additional comments or questions from board members on this section?
Maria, are we on page 5, section F?
Yes, we're on all of page 5, so any section at this point.
Okay, I
Is up
think
for
that there's
discussion.
room in, or I would propose that there's room in section F to add a couple more things to allow them a little more leeway. A couple things I was thinking about was maybe lighting and lighting that was dark sky compliant, and so increases or modification to lighting that's dark sky compliant and doesn't increase the lighting levels over the property line. Might be something that we could consider them having the authority to do without going through the review. And maybe changes to parking configuration and signage that do not either reduce or increase the parking. So if they want to change the parking layout but not change the number of spots, and maybe something such as increasing landscaping and benches, pedestrian walkways should all be, I think, something they're maybe allowed to do. So it's just 3 additional things that maybe we could consider.
So Joe, yes, your thoughts were lighting that is dark sky compliant.
And doesn't increase the lighting levels over the property line.
Yep,
Yep.
over the property line. Changes
that's
to the
something.
parking configuration that doesn't necessarily increase the number of spaces.
Yeah,
And
if they want to
then-
restripe or change the configuration around.
And then, as always, we would not be adverse to addition of landscaping and benches.
Right. So, just a couple
Thank you,
things.
Joe. Anyone else
That's it
who
for section
wishes
F.
to comment?
Madam Chair, just, Joe, just for clarity on the lighting for dark sky compliant. If you were gonna do that exemption, I think we need some additional language with regards to total lumens, because typically under a dark sky compliant lighting pole in a scenario like this, if you were limited to 15 feet high, you would probably have a hot spot under that light of maybe 12 to 14 lumens, and between poles, you'd be at maybe 1 or 2. I could add 20 more poles between the existing poles, be all dark sky compliant, but cover the entire site with 14 lumens. So I don't think that's the intent of the planning board, or I don't think the neighborhood would potentially appreciate that. It may be.
Really, my intent was any lighting that they determine they need for, safety or for pedestrian walkways, for people to get to their cars, that is not necessarily affecting the neighboring properties. And that, if it was pretty, that's what my intent was.
Yeah, I know, I'm pretty sure I understood your intent, but I may add language just so everyone's aware that at least on the lighting, there's at least some review and process through the administrative officer, just to make sure that box is checked, that this is being done for safety, and you're not going for standard lightings for a hospital to the standard lighting for a car dealership. And again, South Kingstown's pretty good at the lighting in their car dealerships, but other communities are not as conscientious of that. But again, some of those car dealers can claim that all of their lighting within the dealership is dark sky compliant, but you could read a book under anywhere in those parking lots.
Thanks, Joe, for those thoughtful comments. While we are on the subject of lighting, I just want to mention something that has come up quite a few times from the neighbors. Issues with changing some of the lighting or correcting some of the lighting. And it seems as though those kinds of things would be, as we have discussed in previous meetings, a relatively easy, quick fix. Although I know that there was a reference at one point to a 2-year lighting plan or correction, but I just thought it would be worthwhile to mention that making a couple of minor changes, I think, would do a lot to create goodwill between the hospital and the neighborhood, and any type of action that could be had relative to doing something like that early on in the process, I think would be really beneficial to everyone.
Madam Chair, Jack Revens, can I address that?
Yes, please.
Thank you. We've just to remind everyone, we've mentioned before that the hospital has approved and a budget to upgrade the lighting to meet the dark sky compliant standards. And we're waiting to get through this process to put that out to bid and engage a contractor to do that work, so that we concur with your suggestion, Madam Chair, and we're anxious to do that as part of this process. And we will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And anyone else comments on page 5? That brings us to the end of the suggested amendments. There are no additional thoughts from members. Do we have the audience, Jay? I can't see it on my screen because you have your, here we go. There are 3 attendees. Wondering if any of those folks would like to make any comments since they are attending this evening. And if you would like to do so, please raise your hand. I believe the shortcut is *9. All right. Board members, any further thoughts going forward? Clearly, the applicant is going to meet with staff once again so that we can continue this in February. I know that there was a sense of urgency from the hospital to get through this process. So obviously, the sooner the better. It was my understanding, Mr. Evans is smiling, but it was my understanding that we would be ready to potentially make a recommendation after this evening for our next regular meeting, but we will have to wait until February. But any further thoughts from Mr. Revens or his team?
No, we thank you, Madam Chair, and we thank the planning staff for their efforts. We remain anxious and trying to get through this process as quickly as we can and satisfy you and the staff about how we're proceeding. And we thought we'd be ready too, but when it takes time to draft this, and by the time it got drafted and got sent out, there really wasn't much of a window between the end of the day on Thursday and this evening to get this together. So unless there's any other options on the schedule for anything sooner, we're off to the 8th, and unless there's any chance of a work session sooner, we'd be available to meet next week with planning, but I don't know how long it'll take. In fairness to everybody, drafting language isn't something you can just sit down and do around the table in a half an hour. It takes a little bit of time, and I know Jamie and his team put a lot of thought and time into this after our discussions that we had on December 17th. So, we may need some additional time after we meet to get the language right. So the next time this goes out to you, there's a consensus between the staff and the hospital, at least when it goes to you for a work session, that we're on the same page. And that's what we're trying to accomplish. And I think Jamie and his team is also.
Yes, thanks very much. Understood. We are all in agreement with that.
Thank
So
you.
we will see you next time around, probably in February. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, I'd like to echo Mr. Revens's comments and special thanks to Mr. Prescott for participating in our December 17th meeting. I think it was important to have the hospital at the table to understand some of the planning board members' concerns articulated through staffs to try and articulate that to the board in the form of regulatory changes.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Prescott. It was appreciated that you were tuned into the concerns of the planning board and were very understanding and trying to bridge that gap to the greatest extent possible.
You're very welcome, and thank you to all of you too, and to Jamie and the staff for all the hard work. I think it was a great dialogue, and we felt heard, and I hope that was reciprocal.
Thanks again. Let's move on to our next agenda item, which is consideration and discussion to schedule special meeting in February 2022. And probably this will include a conversation of what we have to look forward to in the next month or so, Jamie.
Sorry, I had a Labrador retriever poking into the picture. Madam Chair, we have a number of things coming up, primarily Matunic Beach condos. I know the planning board was trying to look at a special meeting for Matunic Beach. We have a TRC meeting tomorrow. based on some of the comments from peer review and discussions with the applicant and their representatives from Decrete Engineering, they're going to ask that the TRC table their application tomorrow and kick that to February. So the next TRC meeting in February is the 9th. So the earliest that TRC will make a recommendation is that date. Your regularly scheduled meeting is the 22nd. There is not sufficient time between the 9th and the 22nd to schedule a public hearing to be able to entertain discussion on the 22nd. So we would be looking at the week of March 1st to hold a special meeting. Or potentially to double up on the second week in March. You already have a work session on the 8th and potentially looking at the 9th or 10th.
So, Jamie, once you have sufficient information, could you send out a doodle poll?
Yeah, we would do that. Again, we're going to work with the town manager's office. If we are going to continue Zoom through February and March, it makes it a little bit easier to have that special meeting because we're only handling Zoom accounts. The planning department has their own independent Zoom account, so we don't have conflicts with town council with regards to those meetings. So we're not vying for the same council chamber space. Again, legal counsel for the town can be at a town council meeting and a planning board meeting on the same night. And in most instances, as your planning director, it can be potentially in two places at once if need be, but we don't necessarily have a conflict. Primarily, it's also conflicts with, affordable housing, EDC, and some other boards and commission that are not regulatory, but we're all looking at that same meeting space. So Zoom may make our life a little bit easier as we go into March. So again, I wanted to see if the planning board was comfortable having a meeting, in essence, which would be at the end of February. February 28th is a Monday, and then March rolls in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of that month, but potentially March 3rd or March 9th or 10th.
It seems so far away, doesn't it? But it isn't really.
Yeah.
But again, I think a doodle poll would be useful, and the flexibility that we have, not having to worry about the physical space is definitely a positive.
Right, and also depending on where we fall with the work sessions with the hospital. Again, the work session for the hospital will be February 8th. Regular sessions on the 22nd, but if there was any delays, you could potentially add them to that special meeting in March also. Instead of having another month delay, there would be a week delay, maybe 10-day delay. I know everybody loves additional meetings.
Well, I
Learned
just
about
worry
having a meeting that lasts till 11 or 12 at night.
No, I think we all understand that, and we want to have energy and be fresh throughout the meeting, and want that same thing for all of the participants. I'm worried just a little bit about our theoretical work plan, which we should discuss at some point. And we want to be sure that we have enough time in our work sessions to try to get all of our lengthy list of projects done. The missing middle, we haven't spoken about that in some time. And again, I just want to be sure that we do have some work sessions that are set aside for our actual planning work that don't end up being specialized meetings for a specific project, that we have enough time to get that work done. And I understand that we always have these great ambitious yearly lists, and I think we should discuss that again at the next opportunity, but just so that we're aware, we want to be making progress on some of these important items.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I want to say I'm relatively confident sitting here this evening that your February 8th meeting with the hospital on that agenda will hopefully be a shorter conversation than it was this evening, because we'll have an opportunity to meet with them in the preceding week or so, and perhaps consolidate the comments and get revisions out ahead of that meeting, which would free up additional time to revisit missing middle. If we know it's going to be an agenda item, I have data associated with the next segment of that I can distribute mid-month in a week or so ahead of that meeting, and also add the work program for we're looking at a calendar year. So I would hope to have a discussion on what remains in this 6 months from a financial standpoint and what we can undertake workload wise, and also what we can start to begin in July or August when we start the next fiscal year and as additional funds become available.
Thanks, Jamie. And as board members have been made aware through an email that I think Jamie sent out this week, Housing Works RI has just published their housing fact book, which Jamie sent out electronically. They sent, I believe, one hard copy to the planning office. I have asked them for additional hard copies, because sometimes when you're sitting around a table, it's easier to look at the book and pass it around and so on. And I'm eager to really look at that.
Yeah, Madam Chair,
to depth.
we asked for 3 additional staff copies, so we
Good.
now have 1 for you, but if you asked for 1 yourself, we'll have 1 copy. But if any of the planning board members look at that report online or have an opportunity to stop at the office and see a hard copy, just let Jay, Brian, or I, or even Lynn know, and we will request additional copies from statewide housing.
Very good. And anything else schedule-wise that we need to be made aware of?
Again, we're entering the budget season. We'll see some slight increases. I'll be requesting some additional consulting funds for next fiscal year. So anything that we start along with operational monies and capital program, we can follow through with those starting July 1. And that, again, I'm trying to do things if we can in a 12-month cycle versus an 18 to 24-month cycle.
That sounds good. So our next regular meeting will be January 25th, and we also have a joint work session on the day before that, the 24th, with the Town Council, the Economic Development Commission, and the Recreation Commission. Is that correct?
Correct.
Does anyone have any liaison activities they would like to discuss?
Hi. Couple things. So I did sit in on the steering committee for the 300th celebration for South Kingstown. There's been 2 meetings so far. The first one I wasn't able to attend, but I did attend the second one. There's a relatively large group, maybe 15 or 18 people, comprised of some residents. A lot of the boards and commissions are represented, some civic groups. And the discussion was a little on what the charge was associated with the steering committee, and that's to kind of plan this year's worth of events. And it's a full year worth of events. So what I got from that, it's something that'll start next January and go through the following December. So these host of events. So they're looking for ideas for events. I asked at that point kind of what the audience was, and with both residents and visitors, but we talked a little about trying to define that a little bit better. So we have, whether it's children, young adults, seniors, residents, visitors from within the state, visitors outside the state. And then when we build this series of whatever the events are, you can use it as a matrix and check off that all these different groups are kind of satisfied. Also, they're looking for different civic organizations that can be involved. But one of the things we may want to think about as a board is, what event, or do we want to propose an event that we could participate in, either as an individual board, or maybe with another board or commission, or maybe as a group with boards and commissions. So I think, Maria, maybe we could think about that, about providing some idea of some event that we could be involved in for 2023.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's one of the events is meet all your town officials, and you have all the boards there, and each board kind of explains what they do, or it's kind of a whatever, and they can meet all the individuals something. But it's something that we may want to think about. They talked a little about branding. They came up with a logo. I think they talked a little about budget. They elected a couple of people in charge of the budget. I think Ken Burke is going to do fundraising. For those of you who know Ken Burke, he was on the Affordable Housing Commission and the Bike Commission. So that's kind of where it stands. But I think the big takeaway there is that it's going to be a year's worth of events, and maybe as a board, we should think about participating in at least one of those events. So that's kind of from the steering committee.
That's great. Sounds really.
And then the other thing was just the affordable housing, and they did combine the November and December meeting. Brian, I might need your help here, uncover it. A couple things, we lost a couple members. Jennifer Kruger resigned, and Ken Burke, I think, resigned. We did get one additional member, Megan Spock, who I think is with the South Kingstown Housing Authority, but maybe you can correct me on that, Brian. She's with a group.
No, I think she may have been associated with Johnny Cake Center. She's
Okay.
In the local real estate business. So, a good set of skills to have for the Affordable Housing Commission. First meeting had some nice substantive comments and input. So I think probably a good add. We still have a couple of 2 vacant positions I think we need to fill. So yeah, looking for anybody out there with interest. I think the big topic of interest at the last meeting was they're looking at putting together some sort of housing event, maybe bring in some speakers to talk about affordable housing, to try and educate the public on what affordable housing is, because I think we have a lot of people with some incorrect assumptions about what affordable housing is and why it's important for the community. So I think that's going to be a topic of discussion for the next few meetings to see what we can pull together to set up an event. And then the other big thing that's going to be on for this year is looking at, implementing various portions of the new comprehensive plan relating to housing.
Thanks.
Thanks. That
That's it,
sounds
Maria.
good, Brian. We could certainly use a large event conference on a state level. It's greatly needed. Okay, is there anything from legal? Any kind of an update? You're muted.
Amy, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, you can see I have a little assistant who didn't want to go to bed. And I'm praying we're going to be in town hall for next month's meeting. Update from legal counsel. You probably all saw from council the settlement on the Garrett Home zoning appeal, 1860 Kingstown Road, the Dollar General. I don't think we need to have any further discussion on that unless anyone has any questions. And you can always contact me privately. You know, we're here because remote meetings are now mandated again. I don't know whether that's going to be renewed in February.
Looks right, Grammy.
So we're still waiting to see if that's renewed month to month. And the wetlands regulations have officially been postponed, or the new DEM regulations that are set to take effect officially will be taking effect in July. And those are all the legal updates I can think of off the top of my head right now.
Great, thank you, Amy. If there are no further comments, would someone like to make a motion to adjourn? Susan and Peter seconded. All those in favor, raise your hands, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Hi, everybody.
Night all. Thank you.
I'll take Wally Cox in the middle for the win.
Hi, guys.
Night.
Night.